Welcome to the Deep Dive. We analyze the sources you send our way, meticulously uh, distilling those key insights you really need.
That's right.
Our mission today tackles, well, it's one of the most critical and maybe one of the most avoided topics right now. The struggling young man in modern society.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one. And this deep dive is based on some remarkably candid analysis we received. The sources, they aren't interested in tiptoeing around.
No.
We're going to look at why it's so hard to talk about this publicly. We'll examine the cold, hard data defining the crisis. And crucially, outline some constructive, aspirational ideas, solutions that could benefit everyone, really.
Okay, so our journey today is kind of in three parts. First, the political, the social hurdles to even having the conversation. Second, we'll dive into the pretty striking data on male decline and fragility. And finally, a positive sort of code for modern masculinity, and then some actual policy ideas. We're jumping right in.
Right into the thick of it. And that starts with what the sources call the land acknowledgement trap.
Huh. Yeah, that's a really evocative phrase. It captures that feeling of exhaustion, When you try to bring up issues about young men's well-being, and the first thing you have to do is sort of prostrate yourself and list all the ways women have struggled and still struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Source mentioned being particularly annoyed by a headline they saw. Young men are struggling. What does this mean for young women?
Yeah, that immediate pivot and that reflex, it's rooted in history, right? For like 99% of history, men did hold the advantage, no question. But the analysis argues pretty strongly that this historical muscle memory, it now creates a real bias in today's public conversations.
So?
Well, look at the examples they use. It's totally fine, even applauded, to cite data showing women are, say, better doctors on average, or lawyers or consultants. People nod, progress.
Okay.
But try flipping that. Suggests that maybe, because of historical needs for risk-taking or physical competition, men might be, on average, better initial entrepreneurs. The room goes quiet. That uncomfortable pause. It's okay to celebrate certain traits when women show them, but acknowledging men might still have some inherent advantages in historically male-typed areas. That feels like a taboo.
And this framing, this polarization, is exactly why the problem doesn't get solved constructively.
Exactly. The analysis suggests, impartially reporting here, that the conservative side maybe saw the crisis facing men earlier, but they often filled that gap by confusing genuine strength with just coarseness or cruelty, which doesn't help anyone.
Right, unproductive.
And the counter-response, often from the far left, according to the sources, is just as unhelpful. Basically, men, you don't have a problem, you are the problem. The sources are clear. We need to get past both of those dead ends to make any real progress.
Okay, so let's park the narrative discussion for a moment and look at the actual data, because this isn't just talk, right? There's a measurable decline, starting with education.
Yeah, the college enrollment figures are maybe the most dramatic indicator. Think about Title IXs. 40 years ago, it was passed to address colleges being, 60-40 male?
Right.
Today, it's completely flipped. It's 60-40 female now, and that's just enrollment.
And completion rates make it worse.
Much worse. During the COVID pandemic alone, 7 times more men dropped out of college than women. 7 times.
Wow, that's staggering.
It's so pronounced that, the institutions themselves have to notice. The sources suggest, kind of quietly, that many admissions directors are basically doing under-the-radar affirmative action for men.
Really? To maintain balance?
Yeah, they're struggling not just to get young men to apply, but to make them feel like they belong, like they're supported once they get there.
And does this connect to how boys learn differently?
Yeah.
Maybe the source mentioned recess?
It does seem to. Some boys' schools offering double the recess time isn't just random. It's a recognition, maybe, that the standard model doesn't always fit. Putting a boy who learns through doing, through moving, into an 80-minute quiet French class. The source says it can feel like physical confinement.
Yeah, I can see that. The system rewards compliance, quiet attention. That can clash with, let's say, typical male energy.
And that leads into this other provocative idea the sources raise. Emotional fragility.
Fragility? That sounds counterintuitive given physical strength.
Right. But the analysis insists that despite being physically stronger, young men are often mentally, emotionally, and neurologically much weaker, or at least more fragile than women.
Okay, weaker or more fragile? How does that actually show up? What's the evidence?
Primarily in their dependence on structure and, crucially, relationships. The research cited suggests men actually need stable long-term partnerships more than women do for basic well-being.
More than women.
Apparently so. When men are unpartnered, especially for longer periods, they're far more likely to drift into unproductive things.
Like what?
Well, the stats are pretty grim. Unpartnered men by age 30 face a 1 in 3 chance of substance abuse. 1 in 3.
Good grief.
And look at loss. Widowers consistently report lower happiness levels than widows. It suggests men's well-being is really tightly wound up with their social connections, their scaffolding.
And the mentorship gap you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The impact of losing a role model.
Devastating. Statistically, a boy who loses a key male figure is immediately more likely to end up incarcerated than to graduate college. That guidance structure is just vital.
And there's a hidden vulnerability, too, isn't there? Something often overlooked.
Yes, and it's tough to talk about. The sources cite a horrifying study. A boy who is sexually molested is 10 times more likely to commit suicide later in life than a girl who suffers the same abuse.
10 times.
The shame, the difficulty processing or communicating that trauma, it has these deep, often fatal, long-term consequences that just don't get the same attention.
Which makes the common online narrative about risk feel incomplete, doesn't it?
Right.
The focus on women fearing violence on dates, being unalived, as the term goes.
Right. That narrative isn't baseless. Women do face risks. But it obscures the statistical reality for young men. The source puts it bluntly. A young man is 16 times more likely to go home and harm himself than he is to harm his date.
16 times.
The overwhelming danger for these young men is internal. It's self-directed.
Okay, so this vulnerability, this fragility, it connects to another concept the sources bring up, the soft bigotry of expectations. Explain that.
It's the idea that society, maybe unconsciously, applauds women moving into traditionally male roles. You know, CEO, leader, powerful position.
Yeah, sure.
But at the same time, it implicitly devalues traditionally feminine roles. Motherhood, nurturing, focusing on emotional intelligence. It's seen as less ambitious, less important.
Like it's not leaning in enough.
Exactly. It creates this weird imbalance. The sources use an anthropology example. Researchers trying really hard to prove women did just as much big game hunting as men, because there's this underlying assumption that the things women traditionally did, raising children, building community, creating stability, are something less valuable than the action roles.
I see. So valuing one implicitly devalues the other.
Precisely. And this shame around traditional roles, it cuts both ways. It's hard for a woman to say, I'm just a mom, and feel societal pride. But the source argues the shame might be even greater for a man who says, I'm a stay-at-home dad.
Ah, because he's seen as having failed economically.
Yeah.
Failed to provide a role.
That's the stereotype. Yeah. Economic failure.
It's like a zero-sum game.
That's the trap the sources identify. Progressivism, in its effort to lift up marginalized groups, a good goal sometimes goes too far. It ends up positioning positive masculine traits, strength, managed aggression, decisiveness as inherently negative, like they're just violence and recklessness.
Which undermines qualities we actually need sometimes.
Definitely. The sources give a pretty blunt reality check on this. They contrast the public talk about wanting a sensitive man with what many women, perhaps privately, still desire. Well, the source uses some very direct language. They say when real threats appear, Russians pouring over a border, a house on fire, you want some big dick energy.
Okay. Provocative.
Highly provocative. But used, I think, to make the point that certain fundamental, protective, competent masculine traits still hold deep value, even if they're awkward to discuss politely now.
So the public narrative might be disconnected from a deeper, maybe evolutionary desire for competence and protection.
That's the argument. And if that's true, and if the old models are broken, young men need a constructive way forward. Not just don't be toxic, but be this.
A positive code. Which brings us to the framework the sources propose. Provider, protector, procreator. Let's unpack the first leg. Provider.
Right. In a capitalist society, this is just fundamental. Men are still disproportionately judged on their economic viability.
Not necessarily rich, but viable.
Exactly. You don't have to be a baller, but you need a plan. A realistic plan to be economically stable. The data ties marriage strongly to income now. It's like a luxury good.
How strong is the link?
Very. 3/4 of men in the top income quintile get married versus only about 1/4 in the bottom quintile.
Wow.
And think about this. The divorce rate spikes by 50% if a man loses his job. That tells you how foundational that provider role still feels, culturally and practically.
Okay. Leg 2, protector.
This is about leaning into inherent physical advantages. Strength, speed, the effects of testosterone. The source argues the most satisfying feeling for many men is feeling capable of protecting.
Not necessarily fighting, but capable.
Right. It could be de-escalating a bar fight, sure, but it's also just providing that sense of calm, of security for your family when things feel chaotic. That feeling of competence is key to male identity.
And leg 3, procreator. This sounds potentially controversial.
It's about acknowledging male drive, that horniness, but channeling it. Not suppressing it, but using that energy, that fire, as a motivation to become a better man.
How so?
Get in shape, get that economic plan together, be interesting, be well-read, be competent. And crucially, it means overcoming approach anxiety.
Fear of rejection.
Yeah. Young men need to practice expressing interest. They need to learn that hearing no is normal, even necessary, on the path to finding those amazing yeses.
And online dating hinders this.
The source argues it does, yeah. It removes the real-world places, the venues where men could previously show their value through humor, confidence, skill, body language. Online, it's often just a picture and a profile.
Okay, provider, protector, procreator.
Huh.
But there's a secret weapon mentioned.
Kindness, but a specific type. The source draws a really sharp line between niceness, which they see as pliable, maybe even manipulative, hoping for something back,
Right.
and true, authentic kindness, which is non-pliable, involves small acts of generosity or support with absolutely no expectation of reward.
Why is that a secret weapon?
Because it signals safety. Stability. The source suggests women, especially when vulnerable, like during pregnancy, gestation, are instinctively looking for that genuine, non-transactional kindness. It's a deep evolutionary signal of a reliable partner. And it's something men can actively choose to cultivate.
That makes sense. Okay, so if economic viability underpins the provider role and is so critical, what about policy solutions? The sources suggest broad fixes first.
Yeah, things that lift all young people, but would disproportionately help young men given their current struggles. The main structural idea is about taxation.
Taxing sweat versus money.
Exactly. Taxing current income, sweat, much less, and taxing accumulated wealth, money, capital gains, assets, often held by older generations much more.
Why?
Because right now, there's a massive wealth transfer happening from the young to the old. People over 70 are, 72% wealthier than they were 40 years ago, while young people's incomes stagnate. Rebalancing tax could directly address that provider gap for the young generation.
Okay, that's a big economic shift. But what about the more targeted policy, the mandatory national service idea?
This is presented as the really big idea, potentially transformative, not military, but a mandatory year or two of civilian national service for all young people, like in Israel or similar models.
Doing what?
Could be anything. Working in national parks, disaster relief, helping with infrastructure, elder care. The point is the experience.
And the benefits would be?
Huge, according to the source. It teaches competence, orderliness, discipline, things many young men are currently lacking structure for. It's also a wonderful equalizer.
So?
It forces kids from totally different backgrounds, different classes, different political bubbles to actually work together and rely on each other to get something done. Breaks down barriers.
And for young men not ready for college at 18?
It gives them a structured, prestigious, skill-building pathway. Instead of just drifting or feeling lost, they'd be contributing, learning, maturing.
It's a compelling idea. So, bringing it all together, the sources define the ultimate goal, the measure of manhood, not by age, but by surplus value.
Surplus value, yeah. It's the point where you are consistently adding more value to the world around you than you're taking out.
Value in what sense? Just money?
No, much broader. Economic value, yes, creating or contributing, but also noticing other people, really seeing them. Generating more love, more empathy, more support in your circles than you demand. Absorbing more stress and complaints than you dish out.
So it's about contribution across the board.
That balance, that net positive contribution, that's presented as the real measure.
Okay, so to quickly recap the positive vision. Young men embracing the code provider, protector, procreator, all aimed at achieving that state of generating surplus value. A challenging deep dive, definitely, but one with some surprisingly hopeful directions.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating, connecting back, is how this decline in male achievement, this rise in isolation, maybe even rage, how it links to the economy. The sources point out something stark. 40% of the S&P 500's value is now driven by companies essentially built on attention, addiction, and rage.
40%. Wow.
These digital platforms, in many ways, profit from keeping people, especially maybe young men, isolated, scrolling, and often angry. They've replaced those real-world third places, the pubs, the clubs, the workshops, even just the workplace banter where competence and social bonds used to be forged.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. The sources argue that maybe the greatest innovation ever was the post-WWII American middle class. It gave masses of men achievable economic viability, stability, and therefore high mating opportunities. So is stable economic opportunity, is that fundamental for male success and societal stability? What radical step, beyond the policies we touched on, could actually give today's young men a similar economic footing to that post-war generation? Think really big. And relatedly, take a moment to consider your own life. How much of your social connection, your sense of value and competence is built on digital convenience versus real-world, intentional, in-person effort and excellence? Something to mull over. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.